talk about sheer cottons. So sheer fabrics are fabrics that you can see through. They may vary from very sheer, so you can see through them very easily, or only semi-sheer, so you can only kind of see through them a little bit. They're only a little bit transparent. Most sheer fabrics, and most of the fabrics we talk about in this section, will feature what's called an open weave. An open weave refers to a fabric that is woven with some extra space between each of the yarns. So you can see here the tiny little holes. Kind of looks like a mesh. Indeed, is very much like a mesh because it has those little open spaces between each of the yarns. This is how we get that sheer characteristic. It allows us to see through the fabric. It's not close and dense and opaque like the fabrics previously. Open weaves are most commonly woven with a plain weave style. First we talk about batiste. Batiste is a lightweight, semi-sheer cotton plain weave, again featuring that open weave. It is soft, limp, and often mercerized for a subtle sheen. Batiste uses combed cotton yarns, as we talked about before, which means it only uses longer, high-quality fibers. Again, the combing process refers to a process of combing out the cotton fibers before they are spun to only leave the high-quality, long staple cotton fibers. This creates a softer, stronger fabric with a higher luster. Gauze. So gauze is originally named for the city of Gaza, and we typically associate gauze with bandages, as traditionally it's used in medicine to help wrap around wounds. The absorbent properties of cotton, as well as the added texture, make it very absorbent, so are very good to use as bandages, as they will absorb blood being let from wounds. However, we can use gauze for garments as well. We don't have to just use it for bandages. It is soft, it's limp, and is sheer. Gauze uses a specific type of weave called the leno weave. Now, we didn't talk about the leno weave in our weaves because it is very, very specific. We typically only use the leno weave with gauze. If we see, gauze typically has a bit of a crinkly texture to it, and this is a result of how it is woven. So when we weave gauze, we use a typical plain weave structure of over, under, but we twist the warp yarns in their position. So they'll swap and be twisted around each other, which gives it this sort of puckered, crinkly texture to it. It helps to add stability to loose open weaves. So although again gauze is using a open weave, so it has space in between the yarns, this type of leno weave gives it added stability, which helps in its purposes, especially in using it for bandages, but also can be used well in our garments as well. If you look very closely at a strip of gauze, you can see the warp yarns wiggling around each other. So we can see normally, right, if this is a warp yarn, it would just go down straight. But it goes in this sort of wiggly pattern, twisting around its partner, but still, if we go down one line, we get an over, under pattern that we traditionally see in our plain weaves. Interesting little variation. And again, these little variations are going to pop up, and there isn't any way I could possibly tell you all the different types of yarn, weave, or fabric variations that exist. You'll just have to discover them all for yourself as you get out into the world of fabric. Our next sheer cotton is lawn. Lawn is a semi-sheer fabric that is very similar to batiste. It is also made with a plain weave, but is not as soft as batiste and is more crisp, not as limp and flowing as batiste, bit stiffer. It can be solid, but we often see lawn printed. Still, the same have a sheer to semi-sheer appearance and quite lightweight and delicate, with an open plain weave. Next we have organdy. Organdy is a very sheer, lightweight, very crisp cotton fabric that closely resembles its silk relative organza. Now we'll get to organza. Both are open weaves, both are plain weaves. However, the easiest way to tell the difference between organdy and organza is how it moves. Organdy is incredibly stiff and feels almost like a fine mesh or tulle. Organza will flow and be very limp and flutter when moved. Again, organdy is made with that plain weave, open weave. It is stiff because we use tightly twisted yarns. Voile. A light, semi-sheer, semi-crisp fabric that is not as tightly woven as batiste or lawn. Voile in French is veil. And this is where it gets its name, as it was traditionally, bridal veils were traditionally made out of this fabric. Now, if you don't know whether your fabric is a batiste, a voile, or a lawn, they're all pretty similar. It's not quite as tightly woven as we talked about before, and whereas lawn tends to be fairly stiff and batiste tends to be fairly limp, voile is somewhere in the middle. We will typically also see voiles in white, although they can be dyed in other colors as well. Next, we'll talk about piled cottons. Piled fabrics, again, refer to fabrics that are woven with that extra set of yarns that are allowed to loop up into above the fabric and create a plush, furry texture above the surface of the fabric. And we talked a lot about this in our weaves, and we'll talk about them again here and look at some of the different variations of plied cottons. Some you'll be familiar with, some will be new. As we can see down here, we have what looks like a terry cloth with those iconic little loops popping up above the surface of the fabric. One of the most iconic piled cottons is corduroy. Corduroy is roughly translated from French to mean cord of the king, or du roi. It got its name as it was a popular fabric worn by the servants of the French kings of the 1600s. Corduroy is a thick, heavyweight fabric with a very plush pile with in distinct lengthwise ribs. These ribs are called wales and are made from the pile. How is corduroy formed? Corduroy is formed a little bit differently than our other piled fabrics that we are used to. Typically, we learn about velvet, but we have a different method for making corduroy. The wales of corduroy are formed by weaving an extra set of crosswise filling or weft yarns into a background fabric with either a plain or twill weave. The extra yarns float over 3 or more warp yarns. Here we see them floating. Then they go back under 1 or 2 of the yarns. So we create these floats that almost look like a satin weave. Although satin, the floats are built into the main construction of the fabric, here we can see a sort of cross section of a typical sort of plain weave or backing fabric, similar to velvet. These floats are then cut in the middle, so they're cut right down here, and the resulting piles spring upward and are brushed to form the wales. So the low part of the wales, the distinction in between the ribs, are this part right here. It's cut here, they spring upward and are brushed to fray out the fibers to create this plushy pile. The middles are left empty, which create the distinctive lengthwise ribbing of the wales. Corduroy can be found with wales of many different widths. Wider wale corduroys are simply named wide wale corduroy. Terry cloth. This should be a familiar one, as we talked about terry cloth both in our knit and in our woven section. And here we have both examples of a woven terry cloth and a knit terry cloth called a French terry. We covered both of these fabrics again in previous sections, but we will cover them again as they are typically made from cotton. Both their weave and knit structure, combined with the properties of cotton, make them highly absorbent and excellent for towels, bathrobes, and when we get to French terry, we see it used in hoodies, sweatshirts, and sweatpants. Remember that terry cloth, when woven, can be looped on one or both sides of the fabric, as well as knit piled can be looped on one or both of the sides. However, French terry is always looped only on one side of the fabric, leaving a looped piled side and a flat surface side. Last we have velveteen. Now, almost always when we talk about velveteen, we are talking about a cotton fabric. Many people will simply associate the difference between velvet and velveteen as being velvet is made from a silk or synthetic, while velveteen is made from a cotton. And most of the time this is true. Most velveteens are made from cotton, and most velvets are made from either silk or synthetic. However, the true difference between velvet and velveteen lies in how it is woven. And this is a slightly different weaving variation that we'll go over now. So, if you remember from our woven section, velvet was made by weaving together 2 layers of fabric with an extra set of warp yarns and then cutting it to produce the pile. However, velveteen is made in a much more similar way to corduroy. So velveteen is created by floating this should say weft yarns. I'm terribly sorry. It is weft yarns that are floated, not the warp yarns. My bad. I'll change that when I create the PDF for you. But velveteen is made by floating weft yarns, as seen here, then tucking them one over. The floats are then cut very close to the surface and brushed to produce the pile. The floats are staggered in a different way than corduroy, so we don't have the barren spots that give us that lengthwise ribbing. Instead, They're staggered to give us an even pile across the surface of the fabric. Because velveteen is made in this slightly different way, we typically see a longer pile, a longer, more plushy pile in velvet, and a shorter, stiffer pile in velveteen. That concludes our section on both sheer and piled cottons. Next, we'll take a look at other weaves associated with cotton, or other types of cotton fabrics.